In this episode, we are getting into one of the quiet foundations of security management, because an organization cannot protect information well if it does not know what information it has, where that information lives, or how important that information really is. New learners often think security begins with firewalls, alerts, or access controls, but those protections only make sense after the business has a clear view of its information assets. That is why identification and classification matter so much. They help leaders move from a vague sense that data is important to a structured understanding of which information deserves the most attention, which information can be handled more routinely, and which information would cause real business harm if it were exposed, altered, lost, or unavailable. Once that structure is in place, the rest of the security program becomes more coherent, because decisions about access, retention, monitoring, sharing, and recovery can all be tied back to the actual value and sensitivity of the information the business depends on every day. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. An information asset is broader than many beginners first assume. It is not limited to a spreadsheet full of customer names or a database sitting on a server. An information asset can include records, documents, emails, designs, contracts, research, source code, employee files, financial data, authentication secrets, business plans, logs, reports, and even the knowledge embedded in a process that the organization depends on to operate effectively. The key idea is that the asset has value because it supports decisions, operations, legal obligations, customer service, revenue, trust, or strategic advantage. Some information assets are easy to recognize because they are formal and visible, while others are overlooked because they appear ordinary or are spread across many systems and teams. A manager may immediately think about customer records, but forget about vendor due diligence files, incident documentation, pricing models, or configuration details that could be very useful to an attacker or very damaging to the business if lost. Good security management begins by widening the definition enough that the organization can see what truly matters. That leads to the first major principle in this area, which is that you cannot protect what you have not identified. This sounds simple, yet it is one of the most common weaknesses in real organizations. Data is created constantly, copied across systems, shared with vendors, stored in collaboration platforms, embedded in reports, exported for analysis, and retained far longer than anyone intended. Over time, the business may lose sight of where important information lives and who is using it. When that happens, security controls become uneven because the organization is making protection decisions without a full picture of what needs protection. An unknown customer data set may sit in a department file share, a sensitive contract archive may remain on an old platform, or operational reports may contain more restricted details than the team realizes. Identification is therefore not just an inventory exercise. It is an effort to reduce uncertainty about the information environment so the organization can make better decisions about exposure, ownership, and control instead of relying on assumptions that may no longer be true. A mature identification effort usually looks beyond the simple question of whether an asset exists and asks a richer set of questions about that asset's role in the business. Where is the information stored? How is it created? Who uses it? Who owns the business process connected to it? How long is it needed? What systems, vendors, or workflows touch it? What would happen if it were exposed, changed incorrectly, deleted, or unavailable at a critical moment? These questions matter because identification is most useful when it produces context, not just names on a list. A data set stored in 3 different platforms presents a different management challenge than the same data stored in one controlled location. A file containing old sales figures may not deserve the same handling as a live export containing customer identities and payment details. Once context is added, the organization can begin to distinguish between information that is merely present and information that is truly important. That distinction helps security leaders focus time and resources where the business consequence would be greatest. Information assets also appear in many different forms, which means identification should not be limited to one department or one technology team. Customer records may be obvious, but so are human resources, HR, files, legal case materials, financial statements, engineering designs, product roadmaps, supplier details, pricing models, incident records, credentials, and internal communications about strategy or acquisitions. Some information is structured neatly inside databases, while other information is unstructured and scattered across email, documents, collaboration platforms, screenshots, or shared folders. Intellectual property, IP, can exist as designs, formulas, source code, methods, or research notes, and each of those forms may live in different places under different controls. Personally identifiable information, PII, may appear in customer service systems, marketing exports, onboarding files, or spreadsheet attachments someone sent for convenience months ago. A strong identification effort, therefore, looks across the business rather than assuming that sensitive information lives only in formal repositories. The organization needs a wide enough view to catch both the official information stores and the practical reality of how work is actually done. Once important information assets are identified, classification becomes the next essential step. Classification is the process of placing information into categories based on sensitivity, business value, legal obligation, operational importance, or some combination of those factors. The purpose is not to create labels for their own sake. The purpose is to make protection decisions more consistent. If the organization classifies information well, then people do not have to guess every time they handle data, share a document, approve access, or plan retention. They can follow rules that match the category of the asset. Many organizations use a simple model with categories such as public, internal, confidential, or restricted, though the exact names vary. What matters is not the wording alone, but the meaning behind it. A public document may be safe to share broadly, while a restricted data set may require tight access limits, stronger monitoring, careful transmission rules, and formal approval before it leaves the organization. Classification turns information value into operational guidance that people can actually use. The strongest classification schemes are built around business reality rather than around abstract language that sounds impressive but means little in practice. To classify an asset well, the organization needs to think about what kind of damage could occur if the information were disclosed, changed, destroyed, or unavailable. This is where the ideas of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, CIA, become helpful. Confidentiality asks who should be allowed to see the information. Integrity asks whether the information must remain accurate and trustworthy. Availability asks how badly the business would suffer if the information could not be accessed when needed. Some information may be highly sensitive because disclosure would violate law or harm customer trust. Other information may be less private, but still highly critical because errors in it could cause financial or operational damage. Some records may not be important every day, but their availability during an audit, legal matter, or recovery event could be essential. Good classification captures those differences so the business can protect information in a way that matches real consequence. Ownership is another central part of both identification and classification because information does not manage itself. Someone needs to be accountable for understanding what the asset is, why it matters, what category it belongs in, and whether the protections around it still make sense as the business changes. In many organizations, the information owner is not the same person as the system administrator or the security analyst. The owner is usually the business leader responsible for the process or outcome that depends on the information. That person is often best placed to judge the business value, legal significance, and operational consequence tied to the asset. Technology teams may store and manage the systems involved, and security teams may advise on standards and controls, but the business owner usually understands what the information actually means to the organization. This matters because classification becomes much more accurate when it reflects business consequence rather than purely technical opinion. Clear ownership also helps when questions arise about access, sharing, exceptions, or retention, since the organization knows who should make or approve those decisions. A good program also recognizes that information moves through a life cycle, and classification needs to remain meaningful across that full journey. Information is created, collected, stored, used, copied, shared, archived, and eventually destroyed, and the handling expectations should follow it through those stages. A document that is classified carefully at creation but then exported into an unmanaged location loses much of the benefit of classification. A data set that is restricted in the production system but treated casually in backup copies, analytics exports, or vendor transfers remains exposed even if the original system was well governed. This is why lifecycle thinking is so important. Security managers need to ask how classification is preserved during sharing, how access is reviewed over time, whether retention rules match the asset's purpose, and whether disposal practices prevent unnecessary buildup of old sensitive information. Information that is no longer needed but still retained widely can create risk without adding value. Strong lifecycle discipline therefore supports both security and efficiency by helping the organization protect what matters and let go of what no longer serves a business purpose. New learners should also understand a few common misconceptions that weaken this work. One mistake is assuming that if information seems important, it should simply be classified at the highest possible level. That feels safe at first, but overclassification creates its own problems. When too much information is treated as highly restricted, people stop seeing meaningful difference between categories, handling rules become burdensome, and business teams begin finding workarounds because everything feels equally constrained. Another mistake is believing that classification is solved once a label is applied to a document or entered into a register. A label helps only if people know what the label means and if processes actually enforce the handling expectations attached to it. A third mistake is treating identification as a one-time project. Information environments change constantly, and a business that does not revisit its assets and categories will slowly drift away from reality. Strong programs keep classification simple enough to use, disciplined enough to trust, and current enough to reflect how information is really being handled. A simple example can make the fundamentals easier to picture. Imagine a healthcare company that handles patient scheduling, billing, treatment notes, employee records, vendor contracts, marketing material, and internal operating reports. Without identification, leadership may know generally that the company has sensitive data, but that knowledge remains too vague to drive clear decisions. Once the company begins identifying information assets, it can distinguish between public marketing content, internal operating material, regulated patient records, HR files, and strategic business documents. Classification then gives those groups meaning. Marketing material might be safe for broad distribution. Internal reports may require normal employee access, while patient and employee records may require much tighter rules because disclosure or misuse would create serious harm. That classification can then influence access approvals, storage expectations, training, vendor contracts, monitoring, and retention. The value of the process is not that the company created more paperwork. The value is that it moved from a vague idea of sensitivity to a practical model that supports consistent handling across everyday work. This is also where identification and classification connect directly to security controls. Access control becomes smarter when the organization knows which information assets are most sensitive and which roles genuinely need access. Monitoring becomes more targeted when teams can focus attention on systems and data stores that contain the most important assets. Encryption decisions become more meaningful when applied based on actual sensitivity and business consequence rather than broad habit. Backup and recovery planning improve because leaders can prioritize the information whose availability matters most. Incident response becomes more disciplined because the organization can judge whether an event involves ordinary internal data or a highly restricted asset that triggers legal, regulatory, or customer obligations. Even awareness training gets better because employees learn not only that data matters, but which kinds of information matter most and how handling should differ across categories. In that sense, classification is not an isolated governance task. It is one of the bridges that connects information value to daily security practice throughout the organization. Maintaining this kind of program requires governance, review, and communication over time. New systems appear, teams reorganize, vendors are added, cloud platforms expand, and old data often remains in places nobody originally intended. Software as a service, SaaS, adoption, collaboration tools, remote work, and self-service data analysis can all make the information environment more convenient while also making it harder to see clearly. That means organizations need periodic review to confirm that key assets are still identified, categories still make sense, ownership is still accurate, and handling rules still match actual practice. Training matters here as well, because employees should understand how to recognize sensitive information and what their responsibilities are when they create, copy, share, or store it. Governance does not have to be overly heavy to be useful. In fact, simpler and clearer approaches often work better because they are more likely to be followed consistently. The goal is to create enough structure that the business can keep its information picture current without turning ordinary work into a constant classification debate. By the end of this discussion, the central lesson should feel straightforward and important. Information asset identification is the work of understanding what information the organization has, where it lives, who depends on it, and why it matters. Classification is the work of assigning categories that reflect sensitivity, value, legal obligation, and business consequence so the organization can handle information consistently and intelligently. Together, these practices help turn information from something vaguely important into something actively governed. They support better access decisions, better monitoring, better retention, better incident response, and better communication about what truly needs protection. For a new learner, this is one of the clearest examples of how security management works at a fundamental level. Before the organization can defend information well, it has to recognize information as an asset, understand its importance, and treat that importance in a structured way throughout the life of the business. When that foundation is strong, the rest of the security program becomes far more effective and far easier to align with real business need.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.